So what is it about large murky lakes that make people want to discover the next Loch Ness monster? Although when you find records dating back as early as the 1900s, it does make you wonder if something large and mysterious really is lurking beneath the surface. Tonight, let's dive into one of those mysteries. This time we're traveling to Newfoundland to talk about Cressie, the monster of Crescent Lake. Good evening and welcome back to Paragirl Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark. I'm your host, K.D. Culpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher and ghost guide based in Regina, Saskatchewan. Now, each week we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan's past and beyond, uncovering dark history, mysteries, urban legends, and like tonight, we sometimes even get into some monsters. So if you're one of the listeners that comes back each week but aren't yet subscribed or following, please hit that follow button and share it with someone who loves the weird and the wonderful like us. I've got more big guests and haunted deep dives coming your way, so join me as we explore the unknown and bring life to the ghosts and monsters hiding in the dark. Now tonight we are returning to another Canadian Legends and Monsters feature episode. In this series, we dive into the eerie tales and mythical creatures that roam the vast landscapes of Canada. Our feature this evening is known as Cressie, a mysterious creature that is said to lurk in Crescent Lake, which is in Newfoundland, bleh, Canada. Sorry, my tongue is not working apparently. I've never heard of this one before, so it was fun to kind of dig into it for this episode. But first, let's talk a little bit about the location, because I personally have never been to Newfoundland, and I've also never heard of Crescent Lake, so it has definitely become even more so on my bucket list, more than it already has been. So for others that don't know, as I didn't before researching this monster, Crescent Lake is a deep, cold, and crescent-shaped lake that is located in the northeastern region of Newfoundland. It is near the town of Roberts Arm, which is a community of approximately 700 to 1,000 residents. Apparently, it was originally known as Rabbit's Arm because of a high number of snowshoe hares that were in the area back in the day. But that changed sometime around in the early 1900s, although I couldn't find an exact date for that. Although it's said to be inspired by a local at that time named John Roberts, who apparently was a very prominent community member and major landowner in the area, so that's why they started calling it Roberts Arm. Now, this area had a big logging industry, like many out in the east, as the lake was used for transporting pulpwood, which is said to have also left the bottom of the lake covered in a thick layer of decaying logs and debris, making it really murky with high turbidity, which essentially means there's just a lot of suspended particles, making it really cloudy and thick and hard to see. Nowadays, the area is used for tourism and recreation, as there is a 10-kilometer hiking trail that includes boardwalks, gazebos, sandy beaches, and a panoramic lookout point known as Hazelnut Hill. There is also an RV park with lots of service sites, boat launches, and a heritage house. The area also apparently has some good fishing spots for Atlantic salmon, or so I read, as I'm not an avid fisher, so I couldn't tell you that for sure. Now I want to take a quick moment to invite you to the Ghoul Guild. If you ever want to step a little deeper into my world, that's where I share early podcast episodes, my freebie vault, my coma audiobook. Basically, it's where you can get early access to everything going on in my world. And if you like the deeper paranormal side, the Inner Crypt is where I post my monthly case files and some of the raw footage and notes from the places I visit, as well as even deeper behind the scenes in what I'm working on, even on the paid side of things. No pressure at all, of course, it's just a cozy corner if you want to hang out with me and the rest of the ghouls between episodes. You can find it at patreon.com, KDK Ghoul Guild. Okay, so let's talk about what the actual legend claims. I was able to find one article from the Daily News on July 5th, 1960, which was the newspaper for St. John's, Newfoundland. The article headline states, "Sharks and Sea Monsters." This was the first article that I was able to find that specifically talks about Crescent Lake and what would later be known as Cressie, and it reads, "To top off the story from St. Philip's, where a fisherman caught a 5,000-pound shark in his net yesterday, comes another story with no tangible evidence from Grand Falls. I'm sorry, but can I just interject to say 5,000-pound shark? Holy crap. It seems that 4 loggers reported seeing an unidentified monster fish in Lake Crescent near Roberts Arm, Green Bay. Bruce Anthony of Roberts Arm thought the monster fish was a giant conger eel when he and 3 other men, engaged in booming logs, saw what appeared to be an upturned dory on a sandbar. As they drew near, the object moved and then plunged into the water, tossing pieces of wood 10 feet in the air. The fish escaped by boring a large trench through the sandbar. Anthony's boat later passed through the opening in the sandbar with ease. Anthony said about 9 feet of the gray fish could be seen in the coastal lake. A game warden is investigating the report. However, while searching for older newspapers, because the claims go it's earlier 1900s that this thing was started to be seen, I did find this very brief mention in the Calgary Daily Herald on August 20th, 1936. It reads, "The Newfoundland Natural Resources Department disclosed today fishermen on the west coast of Newfoundland had reported a second appearance of what they said was a 150-foot sea monster. The department said fishermen at Port-au-Port sent messages to the department last week saying the reported monster had set boats scurrying from fishing grounds in that vicinity. It reappeared, it was said, yesterday." Now, this earlier sighting doesn't say specifically Crescent Lake, but I just found it interesting that both of these accounts were reported on in St. John and talk about this large sea monster in the area. I couldn't find an original story about this sighting in the Newfoundland papers, but I would have loved to check it out. I just, couldn't find it. But I don't know, you may still be asking, what do they say Cressie actually is? So, what is the legend, right? Okay, so apparently monster legends in the lake, or so they say, started long before colonial times, as even in ancient Indigenous lore where there were legends of kind of these monsters in the lake. One referred to, sorry, I'm probably going to not pronounce this properly, Woodham Out, which translates to pond devil, referring to a spirit that lived in the water. And another was Out Tawu, oh my goodness, I'm sorry guys, Tawidyi, or swimming demon. Now these are both entities identified by the Beothuk, which were the original inhabitants of Newfoundland, and were said to be more of a cautionary tale about the dangers of the water. Of course, like many things, European settlers came to the area and quickly turned the Indigenous tales and lore into something about an actual biological monster or beast, which eventually led to commercialism and a tourism brand, as we will talk about. Now, the major sightings of Cressie, specifically, started in the early 1900s, when someone by the name of Grandmother Anthony, I guess is what she was known as, who was an early resident, was startled by a giant serpent while out picking berries near the water. Then there really isn't a lot of sightings other than one mentioned from the newspaper article that I mentioned until the early 1950s, when loggers found something they thought was an upturned boat drifting along that turned out to be a 25-foot long black sea monster. Although honestly, reading the account of this kind of makes me wonder if it's actually the report from the 4 loggers in 1960 that we already talked about. It just sounded very similar. So I couldn't find anything from the 1950s in the newspapers that were similar, which makes me wonder if it's actually the 1960s article they're referring to. But I digress. Then Cressie disappeared again, only to then reemerge in 1991. Someone by the name of Benjamin Radford for The Skeptic, Volume 21, which is an online article you can find, had searched for witnesses of Cressie in 2008. He was able to find that Cressie had emerged for 2 separate accounts in 1991. First in July, when a man named Fred and his wife had been driving along the Crescent Lake when they saw a long, snake-like creature on the water that was at least 15 to 20 feet long. By the time he looked back to take a closer look, it was gone. Then, in September of the same year, a resident of Roberts Arm by the name of Pierce had noticed a disturbance on the water's surface, making him take a closer look from his truck. He said he saw a black, 15-foot-long, dark shape moving sort of like a whale but with no fins, before it sank and disappeared. Now, this was the year that Salmon's Arm decided to put up a statue of Cressie near Crescent Lake. Although some claim there were more sightings in 1995 and again in 2000, I couldn't really find anything notable until 2003. So this time I had found an article on CBC News, and this was titled More Cressie Sightings in Newfoundland on August 14th, 2003. And it reads, reports of Cressie sightings in the lake near Roberts Arm, about 400 kilometers northwest of St. John's on Notre Dame Bay, go back over half a century. But there were none last year, which led some residents to think Cressie was dead. Vivian Shorts of Roberts Arm was one of those who used to think there was no Cressie until she rounded a corner while driving with a friend. I was just a-screamin'. We saw Cressie! We saw Cressie! Excited, eh? She said. She described a snake-like creature with a fish-like head. Can I just add, I love that they put the A in the newspaper article. I love that. Or news article. Anyway. And apparently she wasn't the only one reporting that Cressie was seen in the area again, as the town's clerk claimed to have had multiple reports of Cressie already that year. Then, in 2008, the History Channel would broadcast an episode on the creature as part of Monsters of the North, which likely helped boost the interest in trying to catch a glimpse of Cressie. And this brought even an investigation led by marine biologists to try and find Cressie in the water. But apparently they weren't able to find anything conclusive or inconclusive even, really, because the water was just too murky to see anything clearly. So they had to leave without knowing for sure. Now, still, some believe that Cressie must exist because of large holes that are regularly broken through the ice in the wintertime on the Crescent Lake. Now, supposedly, these holes indicate that Cressie must be coming up to breathe air regularly. By the way, if you like creatures and monsters, you might like my horror books. My debut supernatural horror novel, Coma, was about a man who falls into a coma only to have some creepy creatures take notice of him. If you're interested, I'll throw a link in the chat for you to check it out, as I'll have more books and things to do with monsters coming in the future. And I'd love to hear what you think. Now, what's interesting is that sea monsters are said to be everywhere, not only in Newfoundland, not even only in Canada. In fact, while looking for Cressie specifically in Crescent Lake, I found an account of a monster in Lake Crescent in the U.S. So just to go to show, these large lakes just tend to have monsters in them, I guess. Now, I found an article by Maclean's that talked about people's fascination with sea monsters, or more specifically, Canadians. The article is from July 9th, 2019, and is written by Kyle Edwards, who talks about the Manitoba Manipogo, which is said to be found in Lake Manitoba, and of course derived its name from Ogopogo, a similar water creature said to be found in the Okanagan Lake in British Columbia. Now, apparently there's also even Champ, the lake monster of Lake Champlain, which is bordered by New York, Vermont, and Quebec. Now, what do skeptics say about Cressie specifically, the Crescent Lake monster in Newfoundland? Could it be a creature that is related to Ogopogo or other similar sea monsters that are talked about all over the world? Or could it just be a tourist attraction prank? Some say that Cressie is simply a large eel. Apparently, there have been some occasions when eels the size of a human leg have been spotted in similar lakes in the area. Especially given that Cressie is often described as an eel-like creature to begin with, I guess I can understand why they would jump to this conclusion. Now, others feel eels just can't get that big. So for it to be as large as the sightings claim, it must be a different kind of animal. So some animals suggested to include the northern river eels, which I could kind of see because eels tend to have really dark fur that, it looks slick and oily when it's wet. So maybe in the dark it could be snake-like looking. Others have suggested deer or beavers, as they have been apparently mistaken for lake monsters before. Of course, there are also the non-animal claims, like simply being logs floating along the water, especially given the history of, being a part of the logging industry and the fact that the bottom of the lake is covered in debris from decaying wood. I can kind of understand why this would be one of the skeptics' ways of explaining it. Others go after the holes in the ice more specifically, saying that no, it's not a monster created by Cressie, or it's not a monster like Cressie coming up through and making these holes in the ice, but the holes are actually created by methane gas or thermal vents, or something to do with the breaking down of the decaying wood under the water, and has nothing to do with monsters trying to get air. However, and then others claim that the town residents are simply faking the sightings to boost tourism at different intervals, and that no creatures actually exist. Although perhaps not necessarily faking the sightings as thinking they see a sighting so that they can talk about it, and then having that nice boost in tourism later. However, no matter how much the scientific community and skeptics want to say, without a doubt, that Cressie does not exist, the inability to see through the water well enough to investigate makes it impossible for them to say no. Although I would wonder, given today's technology, with everyone carrying a video camera in their pocket, essentially, you'd think more proof would start popping up, kind of like the Bigfoot and Sasquatch. But I don't know. Or even drones. Like, there's so many drones nowadays. You think drones would be able to see Cressie. But I guess we just don't know yet. Maybe something's out there. But I don't know. What do you think? Have you seen Cressie or any of these supposed sea monsters? Whether that's Ogopogo, Manipogo, or the Loch Ness Monster, or one of the many others. Do you think that something like this could be lurking under the water, particularly in areas where we can't see through murky water or can't reach the depths that perhaps they can? I personally find the ocean terrifying. Although I love the water and love the creatures that live in it, I feel like we don't know enough about the deepest parts of the ocean yet to truly say we've seen everything that can live in the water. So who knows? Maybe there are some creatures that have yet to be discovered that periodically come up into the lakes near civilizations along the coasts. I don't know. Could be possible. Although when they live this closely to people with cell phones and probably drones, I have to admit it becomes a little bit harder to believe. But that's not to say I wouldn't mind heading over to Newfoundland to see if I can catch a glimpse of Cressie myself. Thank you for listening to Paraghoul Paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, check out my free local YQR ghost guide to learn about the top ghosts and haunted buildings in Regina. Within the free download, you'll learn about who the most famous ghosts of Regina, Saskatchewan are, as well as some of the history behind the most haunted buildings. Head over to my website at kdkulpa.com to get your copy today. Now, before you go, I just want to say thank you for being here. Every listen, every share, every bit of support helps me take this podcast further, and interviewing bigger names in the horror and paranormal world, traveling to haunted places, and creating more behind-the-scenes content just for you. So if you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. I'll keep doing my part to make the show something spooky and special, at least as much as possible. Now stay tuned for more episodes where we uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. This is KD Culpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.